If, like me, you were old enough to have been around in the 80s, you might remember it as the golden age of the home stereo system. We had stack hi-fi units, complete with Dolby graphic equalizers, and we had the promise of this wonderful new technology. Yes, no more scratchy records, no more cassette tapes that sort of stretched and snapped. Everything was going to be digitized and put on these lovely little discs. Nothing was going to jump anymore. These were going to last forever. Our music was safe. Well, it didn't necessarily work out like that, but of course, as we know, CDs became hugely popular and sold in their millions, even more so when we got the ability to record onto CD as well. Of course, technology doesn't stand still, the wheel turned again, and CDs were supplanted by MP3s, by streaming. If you're like me and you've got hundreds of CDs, particularly these recordable ones, that of course leaves us with a problem. What do we do with these wonderful shiny discs? Well, today on Dragon's Teeth, I'm going to give you an answer. First of all, thanks to Mel at the Terrain Chooser channel. I'll put the link up to his channel below because that's where I first saw this idea, and I've seen it in a couple of other places since, but it struck me as such a great idea when I got back into wargaming and making terrain. I made some tree bases, some little scatter pieces of 28mm using the CD as a base. So that's what we're going to be doing today, but of course at the moment I'm into 10mm with our fantasy battles, our fantastic battles rule set and campaign we've got going on. There's a lot of terrain down at the club, down at Bedford Gladiators. There's a big storage area with loads of terrain, but most of it is 28mm. There is a little bit of 15mm, but 10mm I guess is it's a fairly new scale, I think. So we're going to need to make some of our own to make our tables not only look good, but give our armies things and objectives to fight over. The first thing I'm going to do then is just start scoring the upper surface of the CD with a craft knife, just to give the terrain that goes on top something to key onto. Now you could use this side, as you can see those scratches are showing through, but this is obviously much smoother this side. This side already has a little bit of sort of texture to it, so we're just going to increase that. I did notice, by the way, when I go through these old CDs, you know, they were never supposed to scratch, were they? Yet these, although being kept in CD cases and everything else, covered in scratches. There we go. From there I'm going to cover up the hole in the centre, and for that I'm just going to use a piece of tape. So our base is now ready. Now when I made these up in 28mm, I wanted them to be features, so I built up a sort of a bit of a height on them. While I still want them to be a terrain feature for 10mm, obviously I don't want these to be built up too high. They're not supposed to be hills or anything else. So I'm only going to put a little bit of ground cover on, and whereas before I use quite thick sections of polystyrene foam, you know, your general packing stuff, I'm going to build up a little bit. I'm going to make those layers much thinner. So I'm just going to carve out a few little shapes from this next. Okay, so we've got a few little hillocks or hummocks there just to break the sort of surface of the terrain. Now, a few things I've got to be aware of when I'm making these. One is the size of the building, of course. So that might range from a tower, which doesn't have a very big footprint, through to one of these larger sort of ancient temple buildings, and all the way up to this very nice sort of classical temple ruin that takes up quite a large chunk of the base. The other thing I want to be aware of course, is I want to be able to place a unit of figures on there to show that they are occupying that space, that they are exploring the ruins. So I've just cut out a 40 by 40 rough template from a piece of carpet vinyl, a tile, and that just gives me that area. I know I want to leave that relatively flat and free of anything so we can actually put the unit on the base. So having got those positioned, I'm going to glue those on and then I'll get some cover over the top of them. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue the tower on before I put the ground cover, so then I'm sure I can bring the ground cover right up to the base of the building rather than have to leave a bit of an artificial space for it. So for that I'm going to use the glue gun. For my cover I'm just using some acrylic filler, and obviously this comes in various tubs and various shapes and sizes. I'm using one of those tubes that you can use with the squeezy gun, but I found from using this before the nozzle is actually quite bunged up with with dried out stuff. One of the disadvantages of using this is it doesn't last forever, so unless you're doing a huge amount of terrain, don't buy a great big tub, because if it's sat on your shelf for 6 months or whatever, it's likely going to be dried out when you come to use it. So I can squeeze out here, and for spreading I'm just using, I've got some plastic sort of sculpting tools, so I'm just going to dip those in water and start spreading this out. It's a bit like putting icing on a cake. So I've been told. I'm better at taking icing off of a cake, but there you go. First tower done then, got a couple of hillocks and a flattish space at the front, so that's ready to have the scatter, and I'll probably put a couple of trees on this one as well. So the other consideration is, of course, these ruins are all quite different architecturally. Now this fits in nicely with our current campaign, which is taking place over a very large area, so I'm thinking, yes, for the north we can have our traditional sort of European medieval castles, but when we come down into the jungle lands of the south, then something like this sort of temple is much more appropriate. So of course the terrain on the base needs to reflect that. What I'm thinking of this one actually is putting a large sort of stagnant pool in front of it, and the trees are going to be more like sort of tropical. So each one of the types I've got, we can say European, sort of tropical, and then I guess we could call these European as well, but these are going to be more sort of, they look like they're more in sort of mountainous or rocky terrain, so again whatever goes on the base will reflect that. So the tower base is ready for painting and to have the scatter put on it. The other 5 I've done the polystyrene foam to build up a bit of terrain. And as you can see, as I said, on that temple, I've made the start of what hopefully is going to look like a sort of stagnant pool or pond at the front of the building. So what I need to do with these now is get some polyfiller on them. That's the terrain sculpted for the 6 bases then. Next step, I'm just going to give those a coat of a cheap acrylic brown paint, just for something to put the scatter on. I'm also going to paint the buildings now, because I figure it would be easy to paint those now rather than put a load of trees and other bits on. and then have to work around those. I'm going to keep it quite simple for the buildings. We've got a black undercoat. I'm going to do a dry brush in grey, then a dry brush in light grey or white. I might use a speed paint or something similar to put a little bit of extra colour in, or I might just leave them as they are. We'll see how they turn out. But first of all, let's get on with the brown. Final job then is to get some scatter terrain on, some foliage, a few trees here and there, and some finishing touches to the ruins themselves. So just using my usual method to get the scatter down, a bit of watered down PVA painted on over the base. And I'm going to use some grassy green scatter for this. As I say, each one I'm going to give a slightly different treatment to reflect the different areas in the campaign setting, but this one can be quite normal. So there's the ground cover done. Just gonna maybe put a tree or two on that. It looks a little bit bare at the moment, and put some grey highlight on that rocky area at the back just to give it a little bit more detail. So the ruined temple is more of a rocky setting, so rather than grass I'm going to use this for the ground cover, but I may put a couple of bits of sort of foliage or vegetation in as well. By the way, I generally mention about buying stuff in shops that you might not think of that are modelling shops. These paper plates were from Tesco's. They were something like £1 for 20 plates or something like that. Very handy if you're doing painting or for scatter, or particularly for these CD bases. They just fit. So once everything is finished, I can put it on a paper plate and leave it to dry. It's much easier to handle like this than actually risking sort of upsetting any of the terrain by picking it up on its own. So for the jungle temple, I'm going to try something different again. This time I've opened the herb jar, and yes, that smells very nice indeed. So I'm going to use that for the ground cover, and I'll probably put a couple more trees on this one. I want to make it fairly busy around the edges while still leaving that space clear at the front for the figures. All the trees I'm using today I bought off of eBay, and maybe some on Amazon as well. There's quite a lot on there. There's places that do 50 trees. If you look for N-gauge model railway trees, then they seem to be about the right size. Some I bought were very cheap, and a lot of the flocking had come off in the bag on arrival. But these are neat. These are like palm trees, and they're solid plastic, so they're not going to shed their leaves. And they're quite substantial as well. They've got a nice big pin on the bottom, so they're very easy with a little dab of glue to fix in place as well. Now this one is interesting. This is one of those happy accidents, I think, because as you can see, where the polyfiller has dried on this base, it's cracked, it's shrunk a bit and has left these cracks. So I could get stressed over that and think, all right, I've got to try and cover this up. Instead, I'm going to make it a feature. So this is going to be in a sort of volcanic area. What I'm going to do then is, rather than put any scatter on it at the moment, is I think I'm going to repaint this black and make these cracks orange, so it should look really lava-y. Is that a word? Probably not. Anyway, that's the effect I'm going to go for. So I'm going to put that to one side for the moment, and I'll come back to that and give that another coat or two of paint. So for the next ruin, this is going to be a rocky area again, like our temple, but I'm going to make this more arid, a bit more deserty. So I'm going for this sand kind of cover now, and again maybe just one or two little clumps of vegetation just to break up the colour a little bit. And finally, we've just got one more tower to do. I think I'm going to keep this one fairly grassy, and I'll stick some trees in this one as well. And there we go, that's all the bases done. I've sealed each of these with a spray varnish. Now I know you've got a few options for sealing your terrain and scatter and everything. So spray, matte varnish. I just happen to have a few old tins of that knocking around, so I've used those. Also you can use a PVA glue water mix. I've even used hairspray in the past. So maybe in the future I'll look at some different options for fixing your scatter. Now the next thing I've got to sort out is my transport to get these down the club, because of course anything that has a bit of height on it, particularly trees, poses a problem when it comes to boxing it up and transporting it. So I'll have a look through my stuff and see if I've got some suitable size boxes. And I say finished, the volcanic base still isn't finished yet. I've actually ordered up some fluorescent orange paint today, so that should be here in the next day or so. I shall get that into the cracks and then paint the rest of the surface a nice sort of shiny black to give that volcanic effect. I'm particularly pleased with the tropical temple. I think that's come out really nice. That's a very nice model, and I think that pool and the trees work really well with it. And you'll notice I've left a space at the front for those 40 by 40 bases for our 10mm figures, just to give an indication that the unit is occupying that base, that they're searching the ruins. Who knows what perils or wonders they may find within. So there we go, there's one use for CD bases, for those boxes and boxes of CDs you might have hanging around. If you can think of any others, do pop them in the notes below. I've seen them hung up in the garden used as bird scarers, not very successfully I imagine, but I'm sure there's some other things we can use these for. As I mentioned, I've done buildings today, or those ruined temples in particular. I'm going to be working up some more of these as marsh areas, small woods, that kind of stuff. So keep an eye out for those as well. I'll get those posted up here once those are done. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks again for watching. Please do keep your suggestions and comments coming in. They're much appreciated. And as always, if you haven't already, please do like, share and subscribe the channel. I'll see you next time.